able to make it today. Yeah, I can see Kenny online as well. So yep, we have a full cohort.
Kenny is online, and Mekna Aurora.
Yeah, she can't make it.
She can?
She can't.
She can't. Okay.
No. So we have two speakers slightly longer.
Fine. Good.
So Lauren.
Okay, so as I was saying, if people can access their university, critical sociology has a volume coming out pretty soon, basically on the election of 220, but it's really on a number of aspects of that. And so my larger paper is there, and I found it really very, very difficult because it's at a very high level of abstraction to get it down to 15 minutes. And hopefully I'll make it in 20. Before I begin, let me just say that for people that do know me, my work is very much rooted in the early Frankfurt School, the Hegelian Marxist tradition, and primarily, as I'll be saying today, the legacy of especially Erich Fromm and Herbert Marcuse. Okay. I kind of begin with a couple little pictures, and it was inspired by an old Clint Eastwood movie called The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, which was sort of a Western. But if you look at the next 3 slides quickly, Camilo. Slide 2. As you can probably tell, this is a number of progressive demonstrations, feminist, pro-choice, Black Lives Matter, the Pride. This was from my hometown, Chicago, etc. The bad, Camilo. Slide. These are some of the bad gal social movements: Oath Keepers, Promise Keepers, QAnon, 3%ers, etc. Slide. And finally, the ugly, which if anybody has paid attention to the hearings that we just had for the last one yesterday, basically showing that Trump basically really wanted Mike Pence to get hung, and this would change the election possibly. This was something, an attempted coup. Okay, slide. My perspective is coming rooted in Hegel and Gramsci. And to begin with it, I want to suggest that this is a terrible time that we're facing throughout the world, but I'd like to think that it's an interregnum between 2 fundamentally different political, social, cultural movements competing for power. A dying, older, conservative, now reactionary movement, people that want to defend essentialist, hierarchical identities that basically give them privilege at the cost of subordinating others. But the youth population, which is the forefront of so many progressive movements, would like to see a different kind of society, one that's egalitarian, inclusive, etc. So I should mention that some of this work does come out of the stuff that Tova and I have done together. Maybe some of you folks know that the work that we did, of course, with Benjamin, on the volume on World Social Forum, Arab Spring, that we generally look at mobilization for dignity as something that the progressive movements seek. Now, one of the two of the main things that Hegel showed was, number one, that the modes of consciousness and understanding, this is the phenomenology, are themselves historical, which includes the understanding of history. For the Frankfurt School, the modes of understanding are not simply the cognitive level, but become intertwined with the social psychological. Slide. Okay, now generally we begin with a very important aspect in our work, or especially my work, the Marxists, starting with political economy, but as a Frankfurt scholar, not reducing things to political economy because they're being mediated through culture and through the individual psychology. Anyhow, neoliberalism has to be understood as the larger context of most social movements of today, for better or for worse. I need not tell an audience like this the effects of neoliberalism: inequality, precarity, the stagnation, if not declining incomes for many, which has really gotten a lot of people upset. The deaths of despair, the term used for many of the working class people that have committed suicide or have become addicted to fentanyl, etc., etc. Um, and at the same time, we generally see that the consequences of neoliberalism have included the various progressive movements as well, some of which were rooted in the earlier phenomenon of the 60s, and many of these movements, civil rights movements, feminism, etc. This goes back not to the 1960s, but earlier, before the 1860s, but that's a whole different topic. The point is that many of these progressive movements, in response to the economic hardships many are facing, but as well as cultural and political things like that, have given rise to what Manuel Castells calls project identities, those that seek more egalitarian, inclusive notions of subjectivity, that would seek to reject the essentialist notions. That in essentialism, we mean this more specifically, that these are God-given, carved in stone identities that are biologically rooted in the DNA, if not more basic things. Notions of racial superiority, patriarchy, heteronormativity, and especially in the United States, Christian nationalism. But this Christian nationalism, you can see this very clearly. We see it very clearly today in the Russian aggression, in Poland, etc., etc. On the other hand, these conditions have also led people to return to a golden age, want to return to a golden age, what Manuel Castells called resistance identities, in which these privileged identities were considered, normal, and part and parcel of that normality was the subjugation and denigration of the other. And by that, we're talking about the subordination of people by race. In the United States, this was very clearly tied to the African Americans and Native American population. Feminism, of course, women were nice and quiet and knew their place once upon a time. I can't remember that, but that's a different story. And then finally, the denigration of homosexuals and gays as some kind of criminals and perverts and mentally ill, etc., etc. And so these hierarchical identities do require a degree of subordination of the other. And a lot of people, including the subordinates, have rejected that. But we, as most of us know, most people don't join social movements, but nevertheless can be swayed. Slide. Okay, in 1971, when Habermas wrote his now classical article on new social movements, he pointed out that these movements were largely concerned with questions of identity, meaning, subjectivity, etc., rather than the more traditional labor movements seeking generally better salaries, more security, job safety, etc., etc. At the same time, a very leading American political scientist who never in his life uttered a word of social theory suggested that part and parcel of what gave rise to these movements was changing child-rearing patterns. And this was the influence of Dr. Spock, who brought Freud into pediatrics and basically said you'd be nice little children and don't beat them into submission to turn them into little authoritarian minor dictators to grow up to be big dictators. And in addition, he pointed out, Engelhardt, that the economic security of the 1960s gave people enough confidence to be able to be involved in social movements and not have to worry about screwing up the rest of their lives if they were arrested because the economy was in good shape. One of the main themes in my work is the notion of social character that comes from Erich Fromm. It means the underlying psychology, the dynamics, the motives, the values, superego, ego, ideal defenses, and all those good things that are typical of a large number of people in the society. They tend to be the most typical. What I want to suggest is that these social conditions gave rise to a changing social character, one that would be more democratic. Not that this was a new phenomenon, and we could probably trace the origins of the democratic social character surely back to ancient Greece, and definitely with Diogenes in the 4th century, who claimed to be a citizen of the world, the pioneer thought of cosmopolitanism. Okay. Now, the conditions of the 1960s, for those of my generation that can remember, we didn't have to worry about the economy, but the conditions sucked. The mass conformity, the general repression, which tied into a lot of sexuality and repression and hypocrisy, and the empty consumerism. This was clearly critiqued by the Beat Generation, the poetry of Ferlinghetti, etc. And some of what were early critical sociologists, such as C. Wright Mills and Alvin Gouldner. C. Wright Mills is probably well known to many of the people here, who talked about the emptiness of biography. People couldn't understand the sociology of their individual problems. Slide. Now, the starting point for understanding the impact of political economy are the legitimation crises of capitalism. This is the concept that Habermas used in terms of certain aspects of the general system, the economic, the political, cultural rationality systems had certain contradictions and failures. And when this takes place, there's a withdrawal of legitimacy, which engenders crises or just contradictions that migrate to the life worlds. That's the realm of experience. This is the phenomenology. This is people feelings that impacts their identities, their motives, and especially their emotions, which are likely to be shaped and mediated, however, through their real, existing, and perhaps imagined forms of social character. So there's a loss of confidence in the system when the economy fails to provide growth or fairness in that growth. When the political system fails to encourage growth, when it fails to improve standards of living, when it begins to withdraw or cut back on entitlements and benefits, pensions, unemployment, etc., etc. The state also is the realm that provides rights to people, provides a legal system for justice, and it needs to provide this to maintain loyalty to the state. And finally, the psychocultural system, the identities and values. People must be encouraged for Habermas, to work and find meaningful identities, meaningful lifestyles and values that give individuals recognition and purpose. Slide. Now, as I said, the reactions to crisis are going to be always already, to use that nice term, already by underlying social character. It would take me probably 3 hours to go into an explication of social character, but to make it very, very simple, I want to talk about 3 typical social characters. One is the authoritarian character. This was first noted by Karl Abraham, one of Freud's disciples, in his now classical discussion of the anal character, that was embraced by Wilhelm Reich, who basically argued that the early child-rearing practices, especially the repression of sexuality in infant children, were necessary to socialize the compliant workers necessary for the factories and offices of capitalism. The downside of that character was, of course, the authoritarianism that basically, in face of crisis, led to the embrace of Nazism. In the larger paper, I go into a lengthy discussion of subsequent studies of the F scale by Adorno and some of Adorno's work on that, but I think most of the people here are pretty much familiar with authoritarian personalities. Many of you encountered them at your universities. In the United States, we call them deans. Conversely, what's probably more important for us is the notion of the democratic character, which gets much less attention and research. The democratic character, like the authoritarian, is a consequence of early childhood experience, but one of warmth, of empathy, of encouraging generosity, curiosity, and creativity, avoiding physical punishment at all costs whatsoever, absolutely none. And there's like 1,000 pieces of research showing the deleterious effects of physical punishment fostering authoritarianism in children that becomes repeated when they become parents. Slide. Okay, now the progressive movements, what I want to suggest, depend on democratic characters. In other words, it's something that most of us know implicitly. Why is it that most of the movements that we support, feminism, racial equality, peace between people, these are nice people. And we like to make these the general qualities of societies. Unfortunately, societies are too often run by the nasties. Okay, now these movements basically rejecting a lot of hierarchical domination have run into, the resistance of people that would defend in the United States whiteness, toxic masculinity, the tough kick-ass form of masculinity, or the kind of heteronormativity that derides gays, trans, etc., etc., which, as I said, involve hierarchical identities require a subordinate, or to paraphrase Hegel again, uh, the master requires a bondsman, and he or she, the master, gets pissed off when the bondsman gains freedom and tells the master to go fuck on himself. Okay, the typical reaction for authoritarians is not simply fear and anxiety of status privilege, but number one, a deep sense of ressentiment. This is Nietzsche's term that he used to describe the elites of Israel once they become slaves of Rome. To make it very, very simple, and this is a very long discussion, that these elites were unworthy. They were morally inferior. Although they had wealth and power and a lot of sex, they were immoral, sinful people compared to the Israeli, especially the priestly classes. They needed not only to be replaced, but to be harshly punished. This is the expression of this sadomasochistic authoritarianism, which is a deep part of authoritarian character. Slide. Now, the progressive movements, depending on where, secondly, what is also going on is that the challenge to these identities evokes the most powerful of human anxieties, the fear of death. What Becker called the denial of death takes place by embracing powerful and seemingly enduring ideologies and institutions, especially nation, religion, and various forms of religious nationalism. These authoritarian characters today accept conspiracy theories of replacement. Such people join the reactionary movements and to alleviate their fears, use authoritarian aggression, as Fromm pointed out, and embrace what he called necrophilia, which he means the love of death and destruction. And then there are people that actually love to see death, destruction, and human misery, as opposed to biophilia, for which Fromm means the passionate love of life and all that is alive. For Joan Braun, a friend of mine, a Fromm scholar, Fromm contrasted the biophilic character, open to growth, change in the future, with the pathological necrophilic character, which was characterized by sentimentality, dwelling on the past, attempting to render the world static, fixed, and presumably dead. The biophilic was future-oriented. The necrophilic wanted to flee the present and restore the golden age. And this is a theme in almost every authoritarian reactionary movement. Slide.
We've got 2 minutes, 2 minutes.
I'll need about 3. Well, I'm pretty close. Okay. Well, what comes next? Well, what I want to try to make it really quickly, what we're seeing is that we're at a period of an interregnum. What Gramsci described as that moment when the old system is dying, but the new is not yet born. And the symptom of that interregnum is the eruption of morbid symptoms. And this is everything from schoolyard harassment and bullying to the mass shootings, etc., etc. We also see the contradictions of neoliberal capitalism that created great wealth, but basically very ill distributed, and the retrenchment of government services has done havoc in dealing with international problems like COVID. Slide. Okay, so where are we next? Okay, at this point, to try to make it really quickly, I want to mention that part and parcel of critical theory that gets little attention is its utopian promises, its visions of the good society. This basically comes out of Marx's notion of alienation and class domination, which his critique was meant to overcome that. And to provide a post-capitalist society where people would be equal, free, overcome alienation, etc. Slide. Now, both Marcuse and Fromm basically were among the first scholars to read the 1844 manuscripts. That's a critique of alienation. And each of them basically came to a very similar perspective in terms of what impelled social movements. The difference between the authoritarians, the ones who maintain their power or privilege, and the more democratic people that seek a humanistic society. One that for Fromm provides people with a need for relatedness, transcendence, rootedness, it's framework of devotion and identity, where people can find creative self-realization, live in harmony with each other and harmony with nature. Slide. Marcuse offered a similar view, especially in his later work, where he moved away from his earlier pessimism and talked about a post-capitalist society, which required a small number of people to have what called a new sensibility and a new kind of society that would value life over death, much like what Fromm called biophilia versus necrophilia. Slide. Okay, now how is this going to take place? To make a very long story very short, what I want to try to suggest is that if we take Mannheim's notion of generational identity that takes place in people when they come of age, along with Fromm's idea of dynamic character change, the social conditions of today are in fact generating a progressive movement throughout the world. But as we see, those progressive movements dialectically, as I go back to Hegel, also foster reactionary movements. But there is hope, and that hope does come from the Z generation, the young people. Some of them are our kids or grandkids. Slide. So this Z generation is basically the largest, most progressive, at least in American society. Their identities were not only formed by early child rearing that tended to be more empathic and democratic, but they were exposed to Arab Spring, Occupy, the school shootings, and the nastiness of Donald Trump, which anybody in the United States saw on file yesterday. Anyhow, they're the most progressive generation in American history, and they do promise to be the vanguard of the future. Slide. So the conclusion is that the dialectical movement of history, as we understand Marx and Hegel, beginning, of course, with material changes, economic changes, gives rise to the notion that what we're seeing today is a clash of social movements. A set of progressive movements, whether gay rights, feminism, racial justice, etc., being inspired a reactionary movement that does tend to be very popular among many people that don't want to give up their privileges. But nevertheless, this fundamental approach that I've outlined does have a progressive future in mind. So as I conclude, although the emancipatory progressive movements will lead us to a more humanistic society, they also create the resistance of big capital, as well as the reactionary movements that it often funds. But the truth of the matter is that history is on our side. Oh God, we hope so. Slide. I guess that's self-explanatory. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lauren. And I would now call on our next speaker, who is Kenny, to begin his presentation. I don't know if he can share screen or if Camilo is taking on the screen sharing duties for Kenny. But Kenny, the floor is yours. Same again, just about over 20 minutes if you can, and welcome.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. And are you able to see my slides, please?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So thank you very much to the organizers of this very important conference. And my name is Kenny Chiwarawara. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Social Change at the University of Johannesburg. I joined very recently. So I'm talking about elements of a movement forming in South Africa's local protest evidence from Cape Town. It's more of a question really whether there is a movement forming in South Africa's local protest. And what I plan to do today in this working paper is to really raise questions. It's still a working paper, and I do welcome any comments, any contributions, any questions that you may have, but it's still a working paper, and I draw evidence from my PhD and master's research that I did in Cape Town. I'm going to talk about my methodology later, very briefly. So, but in my PhD, I looked at the struggle for urban development, and by urban development, I meant housing, water, electricity, refuse removal. But then, if you consider South Africa, South Africa has witnessed a record number of protests. In highlighting the frequency with which protests happen in South Africa, Alexander, who presented yesterday, describes South Africa as the protest capital of the world, indeed. But when we consider South Africa's community protests, what is often said about these protests when they are contrasted with other protests around the world, where, for example, in Tahrir Square, people occupied squares and huge numbers of people gathered in different places in the Arab Spring, Occupy movements and all that. South Africa's protests are considered to have these three important, because there are others, but these three are very important characteristics. Number one, that they are localized and they tend to happen and they're issue-based, but they tend to happen in similar low-income areas where they are localized. And these areas can be wards and neighborhoods. In some areas may not be protesting, but it's very localized, not this mass movement where people come together. And then there is a term that is usually used here in South Africa that is a popcorn protest, or it's the mushroom protest. They just mushroom and pop up, almost like aspects of spontaneity, spontaneous contestations, which flare up and immediately subside. And the third aspect is that they lack an ideological driving force and coordination between and among them. Now, what I seek to just raise in this paper is that because they happen a lot, because these protests occur a lot in these same vicinities, these same areas over a very long period of time, and somewhat the same kinds of people are involved in these protests, and these different people have different levels of consciousness. Is there a ground for us to perhaps consider that perhaps there are certain elements that are evident in these protests that can point to a movement dynamic? So what is a movement? So a social movement, social movements are diverse, of course, and this makes them very difficult to define. Tilly, for example, admitted that for many years he avoided the term social movements because it brought about different meanings, leading to more obscurity than clarification. Of course, later he defined a social movement as involving ordinary people's collective claims on authorities, elites, and other groups by means of campaigns and performances. And indeed, in many of these protests here in South Africa, there are quite established performances that people carry out. So social movements are not necessarily formal organized institutions, but are often broad informal groups which pursue shared ideology or goal in society. That's Zoud and McCarthy. And now we wonder whether, again, the question is whether they have that shared ideology. Della Porter and Diani argue that a social movement is not a single organization, but a network of informal or formal organization, depending on different circumstances. Very important. And then, of course, social movements play a pivotal role in allowing ordinary people, and which are the people we see actually in these kinds of local protests, allowing ordinary people to participate in public politics. That's Tilly. So can we regard ordinary people's contestations for service delivery in Gugulethu, where I did my master's and my PhD, and then in Khayelitsha, where I only did my PhD study there, as part of these social movements? So in terms of the methods that I used, this is a working paper, of course, like I said, and which draws from my master's, my PhD. I studied one of the provinces. In this province, I looked at Cape Town, and in Cape Town, there was Gugulet and Khayelitsha. These are very low-income communities, and Guguletu, for example, is an older township that started before in the 19 way back. You know, it was established through the Group Areas Act, the 1950s. It has engaged in several protests, and even today is still engaging in some protests. Khayelitsha also started pre-1994, but it's a newer township compared to Guguletu. And in Guguletu, I did my master's research there, chiefly from one ward, Ward 44. And then for the PhD, I did again in Guguletu in that same ward in other wards, but also in Khayelitsha in different wards as well. So for Guguletu, then I have somewhat of a longitudinal data that I gathered. So what was quite interesting was that years after my master's studies, when I went back again to collect data in Guguletu, where I had done my master's, it was quite interesting that I met the same people. Of course, there were other people that I met, and then there were other people that I interviewed for my PhD who for my master's, who were no longer there when I interviewed them for the PhD. But it's quite interesting to see the continuities that some people were still protesting maybe 3 years before, were still protesting again when I interviewed them later after years, which is quite interesting, I think. So in terms of the preliminary findings, it was quite interesting to note that the individuals that I engaged with and that were my participants indicated that they don't think it's fair that they have to fight for what they deserve. And this, I say, voices from below. So in a focus group discussion, a protest leader in Khayelitsha best captured the essence of the other discussants. Sorry, he stated that I don't think that we need to protest for what we deserve. We deserve houses, we deserve refuse removal, we deserve the cleaning of the streets. And so they felt that it's not fair that they have to go through the protest for these things to then happen. And this was in Khayelitsha, of course, where I drew this quote. But in Guguletu, some once very active older protesters in a focus group reviewed their lack of enthusiasm to fight for what they deserve. They stated that they did not want people to view them as beggars and say, see them, they are doing it again, perhaps pointing to protester lethargy. So while there is a general belief among communities in South Africa that grievances expressed in protest form are more likely to be addressed, evidence from my participants show that the activists are not protest hungry. In other words, they're not always ready to go and protest. In fact, before they protest, they engage in a number of other processes meant for them to get the services they require. So, for example, in Gugulet and Khayelitsha, participants indicated that there are several processes that are followed before the community decides to protest. For example, an elderly woman in abreast with the developments in Gugulet described, for example, what they do before they protest. They said, we first call the street committee with the service delivery complaints that we have, or whatever complaints that we have in the community. Then the street committee, as a representative of the people, then addresses the ward councillor and the local, again, a local government right there. But if the ward councillor does not do anything, then the community members will go to the ward councillor. And she says, before we confront him, we call meetings with him. When there are no answers and there is nothing satisfactory, we then resort to protest. So this is not the first thing. This is actually the last thing that people then do. And again, when people are now thinking about doing protests, there are certain processes that they engage in these communities. So, for example, these include structures. So you can see that there are elements of a structure of organization in these so-called popcorn protests. So these processes include community meetings. So people gather, and what was quite interesting in interviewing both in Gugulet and Khayelitsha was that when people want to protest, they don't just protest. My findings show that they actually have to get permission from community leaders, and these community leaders wielded a lot of influence. And in these plannings and these organizations, the mobilizations before the protest itself happened, they then had, people had to come together and indicate whether they will be in the meetings that they're going to have. And sometimes there was even the signing of registers and the drafting of letters before even the day of the protest, which was quite interesting. In terms of the signing of the registers, I thought it was quite interesting to see, in these local communities, people signing registers really, that and it can be thought of as a way to monitor attendance for logistical reasons, but also the registers can be used to identify and even discipline people who would not want to participate in these processes. I don't have enough time to talk about some people who have been disciplined, perhaps because they indicated that because they did not participate in some of these protests. In Gugulet especially, where some of the participants actively participated in the struggle against anti-apartheid, and some of them were even soldiers, and some of the key ones were in the soldiers in the anti-apartheid, but also some of them were then soldiers after independence, post 1994. So the word comrade is a struggle term, and so they called each other comrades, which was quite interesting. But one way of looking at it is that the word comrade is a struggle term which speaks of the people who had participated in the struggle against apartheid. And then these seasoned activists serve as mentors of the next generation, while at the same time also participating in the struggle for urban development. And it was quite interesting when in dealing with in interviewing people in Gugulet, for example, that there was some structure that one could actually see. So, for example, in Gugulet, there was this hostage situation that took place, and the hostage situation reveals that the leadership and the camaraderie and how people listen to each other and value what the leaders say. So in this hostage situation that occurred, first, it was an issue of the water meters that were installed. So before, there were no water meters where water was restricted, but at some point, the city of Cape Town decided to put water meters, and so you had an allotted amount of water that you could use per month. If you have gone beyond that, and then the water would be cut. So what happened was that before the hostage situation took place, people called, because some people would then have water, some people don't have water, so the community didn't quite understand what is going on, because others have water, others do not have. And so they tried to call the municipality, to the officials to come, but they indicate that they did not come. And then what then happened was that people vandalized those water meters. And they indicate that when they vandalized, they felt that the municipality did not feel the pain of the vandalism that had happened. And so at a later stage, when they caught up with one of the contractors and his company, this contractor was installing these water meters, they held him hostage. And this was a white man that they held hostage in Guguletu. And again, to point to the aspect of the leadership, the leaders remember that some people in Guguletu then say, let's beat up this person and his crew to make an example out of him. But again, leadership, the leaders stepped in and said, no, let's not do that. Let's rather hold this person hostage until the municipality comes. And indeed, the officials came, and from that moment, there was free flow of water when I interviewed them, and they recounted this as a victory. Of course, while I talk about the aspects of comrades, it doesn't mean that all the activists come from the same group or background. They have different backgrounds, religious backgrounds, political backgrounds. As one committee leader said, actually, that you do not drink water as a political entity. You just drink it as a person. Everyone drinks. As I try to round up, One aspect that was quite prevalent was land occupation, and this was quite prevalent in Khayelitsha than in Gugulethu. In fact, in Gugulethu, they said that there is not enough land at the here now, and the leaders remembered again that there was a time that people were even saying, let's go and occupy a gravesite and build houses there, again pointing to the desire to build houses. But the leaders then said, no, we cannot do this. And when people are pushing to get land or housing, it's quite interesting because it talks about there is a conflation of issues, because with the land, people want to build houses, and when people are fighting also for housing, and what they are thinking is that a proper house will have water inside, will have electricity, and all that. So, and then other people, when they think about land, they think about notions of democracy, with some saying, you know, this is the post-apartheid era, and we should have land that we can point and say, this is our land. But what is quite interesting, again, I think, to try to link to what the previous speaker, who spoke very eloquently about Gramsci, and the aspect of land occupation, I think, is a challenge to the dominant common sense of private property as sacrosanct. I mean, using Gramscian language, one would say they are moving towards a good sense, moving from the common sense of saying, you know, land, you can't touch it, it belongs to someone or to the government, but they want to occupy it by force. So Ransman, for example, when she was studying the anti-privatization forum as in Gauteng, shows that bridge leaders, key leaders, they play a pivotal role in politicizing the seemingly private issues of the community and linking a movement's message to the everyday experiences of potential recruits. So while I think that there is rising awareness, I do not claim that all participants are at the same level of consciousness, but I do believe that there are pivotal leaders also in these movements who occupy a very important role and provide that kind of leadership. So this is an activist contest or PS common sense about private property and move towards good sense. For example, occupying vacant land to build houses, or occupying vacant buildings, something that has happened in Cape Town. So these leaders bring their learned organizational and tactical law to these struggles and apply autonomous movement principles which discourage activists from wearing political parties' regalia and brandishing political social movements banners. So what we don't see them now wearing certain t-shirts or whatever, because they say, well, we want everyone to come and be involved in these kind of protests. So what they do further conceal the organization and the kinds of people that are involved in these kinds of protests. So although there is no outright challenge to the status quo, protesters have a rising consciousness, which perhaps points to a movement dynamic. And so in conclusion, South Africa's community protests are localized, yes, mostly they happen in localized places, yes, but at the popcorn contestation, we just flare up and immediately subside, because even when they've subsided, there are certain things that are going on behind the scenes. For example, and then of course, the protocols that I spoke about and how people engage in trying to ensure that they get the service that they require. So Trevor Ngwane at the University of Johannesburg also said that when people take to the streets, they should perhaps brandish banners that are written all protocol observed, because they would have tried to, you know, get the attention of the officials in other ways before engaging in protest. What we see in this place, that is a progression from more orderly protests to more militant protests because of lack of this of response. Again, if one looks at the example that I gave in the hostage situation, there was a progression from just calling, vandalizing, and to more kind of holding someone hostage. So is there lack of an ideological driving force and coordination between and among protest action? Yes and no. Different actors have different levels of consciousness, and there's a rising consciousness in these protests. And so these are my thoughts. And I welcome any comments and questions, but this is a working paper and it's still to be developed. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Kenny, for your presentation. I would now invite Lauren to rejoin us for the discussion part of the session. And I would throw the floor open at this point, invite anybody who has any comments or questions to make themselves known. Who wants to be the first to kick off the discussion? Any questions for Lauren or Kenny, or any wider observations that anyone would wish to share? Lauren, I think you're on mute.
Just a very, very quick comment on Kenny's paper with very slight overlap with mine. Just the fundamental point here is that private property has been raised to it. It's generally considered as the normative nature of how human societies exist. But those of us that know anything whatsoever about history know that it's a particular formation that began, I don't know, say sometime before the Renaissance. The Renaissance represented the rise of the bourgeois class, but that it's not eternal, and that it can be changed. That will take a lot more work than simply demonstrating over water or over feminism or something like that. But I think from what I was saying about neoliberalism, it has basically shown that this particular stage of capitalism works very, very, very well, but for a very, very small number of people. The majority of people get screwed over. The other thing I was thinking as I listened to what he was saying, if we go back to the anti-apartheid struggle, this basically does reflect one of the main points I was making of the progressive people seeking democratic, egalitarian relationships as opposed to the white defenders of apartheid. Did they not want to give up their privileges? And it was not just economic privileges and political control, but it was also the psychological benefit of being better than someone else. Fortunately, they're out of power, although what's happened since, I'm just thinking of Zuma, may not fit all that much better. But I just think that, even though mine was at a much more higher level of abstraction, that some of the points that I was making fit perfectly with what Kenny was saying. Kenny, did you want to comment?
I think thank you. I think that's quite interesting. I think you have covered it quite well. And, I think that, just to try to move away from that, but I think that if one thinks of the politics that has been involved as well, in terms of especially one thinks about the occupation of land, the land occupation and all that. And I think that, for example, the economic freedom fighters has done quite a bit in terms of talking about occupying land and raising that awareness as well. And of course, I think the ANC also adopted that at some point. So like you said, it's not static, it changes over time. And so I think that's quite interesting.
One of the largest movements in the world is, of course, the MST, the Movimiento Sans Terra, the landless peasant movement.
Any questions or comments from the floor for our speakers? Anyone like to jump in? While we're waiting on some folks to jump in, I would ask a question quickly to Kenny. You mentioned in your presentation there about instances where logs were kept of those who did not participate in particular instances, and you mentioned that there were certain forms of punishment involved. Can you elaborate a bit on sort of what kind of discipline was meted out to those people? What kind of things are done in these circumstances? Because I thought that was really interesting.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your question. And so this happened in Khayelitsha, actually. And well, quite interesting, because the lady said that because people felt that I was sympathetic to the government, they stoned my house. She said that they stoned my house when they were protesting because they felt that you are supporting the government. But this same lady, though, was quite interesting because she said that protests are actually helpful at times, because she then pointed to her own house, saying that the RDP house that I have has 2 doors and doesn't have an asbestos, whereas the other RDP house in another location does not have this service. It has a cheaper design. But because people felt that I did not participate and I'm not supporting this protest, they actually stoned my house. And so it was quite interesting, to see. Yeah.
Thanks very much. Anyone want to jump in at this point? Any hands raised? Anybody want to just feel free? if again, while we're waiting, I'll throw one at Lauren this time, maybe. You mentioned in your conclusion, Lauren, that you see a lot of hope in sort of Generation Z, if you like, as sort of the most progressive generation of quite some period of time. And I think there's much to what you said. But if we look at sort of those who take a more right wing persuasion, they kind of really denigrate this generation as snowflakes, as kind of the archetypal individualists, and yet you're arguing that you see that this generation actually as sort of very hopeful overall, and sort of why do you think there's such a if you like really negative press for Gen Z, despite all the kind of disadvantages that they faced as opposed to previous generations?
Well, let's see. No, I'm not muted. I think I can be here. You hear me? Basically, power resists giving it up, and basically, one of the ways that power is maintained, and this is clear in the anti-apartheid movement or the apartheid supporters, is by denigrating. Now, in the larger paper, I sort of begin with what happened on January 6th, 2000. Everyone should be aware is what happened at the Capitol of the United States. There was this tremendous, insurrection coup encouraged by Donald Trump. But what didn't get noticed is that in Georgia, one of the more conservative states in America, however, it's changing in large part because, for various reasons that I don't want to bore people with, that a lot of African American families throughout the country have moved to Atlanta because of its now more cosmopolitan changing nature. And what happened in Georgia at the same time that the insurrection was taking place is that Georgia elected an African American senator, Warnock, the first African American senator, and a Jewish senator. Why? Because Bernie Sanders had about 30,000 kids going down at the height of COVID, knocking on doors, bringing people out, carrying people, to the polls and things like that. In 2018, because of the Z generation, the Democrats regained control of the House. They only got it by a few votes, but they did gain it. So, in other words, yes, and the problem here that you're alluding to is that many of that generation is basically, they see that what we have is moving from a neo-fascist, if not an actual fascist like Trump, to a guy like Biden. I'm a socialist, so bear in mind that I'm not a Democrat. Biden has been, completely useless in a number of ways, and as many of us on the left will say, the big problem is that the right are Nazis and the Democrats are useless people with no balls whatsoever. And so a lot of them don't even believe that political change can take place. And yet, and we know this from a long history of social movements, most social movements, the people that are out there are generally the younger people. And so the person I do so, besides Tova, the other person I work with, a guy named George, he basically, when he saw the first shots of the insurrection at the Capitol, he says, it looks like the revolt of the grandfathers. Most of them are older, grayer, and have beer belly. Well, not only drink beer, but somehow have that belly. So in other words, yes, it's going to be denigrated. It's just like, and to say that they're crazy and they're indifferent and things like that. On a very personal level, not too long ago, there was a small little gathering going on in my backyard. And a couple of young women, the oldest was 29, I started talking. I can't believe the intense outrage they had. They were furious about the overturning of Roe v. Wade. And being my optimism, which always makes me a contrarian and puts me outside the mainstreams, I'm not that sure that, according to the polls, the Democrats are going to lose their asses right in the next the midterm. That they have infuriated large numbers of women, and hell hath no fury like a woman whose reproductive rights are being stolen away from her. And we tie that in with the fact that the hearings are influencing a small number of people. And the gun issue in this country is just unbelievable. We had a shooting in one of our rich suburbs about 2 weeks ago. One of my high school buddies was there. He and his family didn't get hurt, but his wife got splattered with blood because an AR-15 doesn't make a nice bullet hole. It splatters when, you know, and things like that. So I think that these issues are slowly but surely going to be moving enough people out of the Republican camp. And this is already taking place. Now, as I said, I'm a Democrat and don't usually support Democrats. But right now, this is the only alternative that we have right now. And at least the Democrats created a little bit of space and give some rights to gays and women and minorities, etc.
Thank you very much. I see we've just gone to 2:30. So Camilo, do you want to let us know what's happening next in terms of break, or whether we're continuing on?
So Sean, thank you so much for sharing the session.
And may I thank our speakers as well before I hand over to you fully.
Yeah, so thank you, Lauren, and thank you, Kenny, for the presentation. So I'm just going to give the post to Liana. So we are on time, surprisingly. So Liana, would you like to have a break now, or would you like
to? If you would like to have no more than 10 minutes break, and start the last session 5 minutes before.
Perfect.
Because as I told Camilo this morning, I need to close the conference just 10 minutes before, because I need to go to another meeting that it was not planned, but I must go because academic commitment. So we have a short break, 10 minutes, and we are here 5 minutes before the scheduled time, so 3:40.
Perfect. So
okay.
See you in 9 minutes.
All of us agree. It's also because we can continue, but I saw that one of our speaker is not here. I already sent her email, so we wait for 10 minutes, and then I send her also WhatsApp.
Perfect.
Okay.
So see you in 8 minutes. Thank you, Liana.
In a bit. Bye.